As I stand here on London's Underground, once again waiting for another train chums to get to work, it makes you realise exactly, just how far we've come. Because let's not forget, during the height of the Second World War, so many people every single night had to bed down in the London Underground to escape and survive and then get ready and go to work the day after. That is if, of course, they had any work left to go to or if it wasn't bombed out. Which brings me to this particular picture that I wanted to share with you today. It's a very famous picture, as you can see, of none other than the Right Honourable Sir Winston Churchill on the balcony of Buckingham Palace alongside the King and Queen on Victory in Europe Day. And this picture, I get asked about this by so many people when we get talking about history and stuff like that. How did it come around? But more importantly, what is the background to this? And literally no other British Prime Minister in all of that time has ever been invited to stand alongside the British royalty on that balcony, the famous balcony that you can now see, of course, when you go on the yearly Buckingham Palace tour. But there's far more to it than that. Let me explain. The diary chronicled every wartime meeting between His Majesty the King, King George, and his favourite British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, the only PM the monarch called by his very first name. Not a bad achievement, eh? Now get this, after Churchill moved into 10 Downing Street on May the 10th, 1940, the day that Adolf Hitler invaded the Low Countries, the King and the Prime Minister had lunch at Buckingham Palace. This was on a Tuesday, and this continued throughout most of the war, apart from on very special occasions. Now what's interesting is they had to serve themselves literally from the sideboard at Buckingham Palace. This was because no one else was allowed to be present or indeed in the room except on very rare occasions Queen Elizabeth, later known of course as the wonderful Queen Mother. Even servants simply couldn't be trusted. Now this really was because Churchill told the King every major secret of the war. Now again, when you think, big responsibility. Now this is where it gets even more interesting for me, because consequently, after every meeting, His Majesty the King, the Queen's father, wrote down everything that had been discussed, and plus his own personal thoughts, including how his exiled brother, who gave up the crown, must never be allowed to return to Britain. I mean, there it is in black and white. So obviously he'd made that decision, right? The war secrets in the diary included the fact that the German Enigma codes had actually been broken at the now famous Bletchley Park. Definitely a museum worth visiting, chums, let me tell you. And also that the atomic bomb was being developed in New Mexico, and which generals, ministers and admirals were going to be hired and fired. Fascinating stuff, I'm sure you'll agree. Is how that friendship developed and then continued further on, as you can imagine. We all know that the Right Honourable Sir Winston Churchill became Queen Elizabeth's very first British Prime Minister. But King George, being a very kind man and the sort of person that he was, had already laid the foundation stones for that. He knew very much so that he was very gravely ill, obviously, towards the end of his life. And he purposely sought out Winston Churchill and said, if you did return to office, will you look after my daughter? A very kind gesture, don't you think? Because, we have to remember that the Queen was incredibly young. And that really is what Winston Churchill did. But going back to the picture at the beginning, a lot of people were absolutely shocked, simply because there you have the reigning, if you like, British Prime Minister alongside the reigning monarch. And apparently the King and, of course, the princesses were very hurt and dismayed when Winston was turfed out of office with his Conservative Party and replaced by a Labour government. In fact, the King, in his diary, has detailed the fact that he couldn't believe, after all the effort that Winston Churchill had done for the great and the good of the British people and their freedoms, that he would be treated so badly. Churchill was a little bit more emphatic about it and basically said, maybe it was time for a change. They've seen enough of me for many years. I might represent darker times. Consequently, even then, he had a real grip of what the public wanted. And as we know, he returned back to better times a little bit later on. But fascinating to see and find out these particular individual things. Many years later, of course, when the Queen was on the throne, she constantly had this friendly banter between herself and Winston because, according to a source, he was so kind to her father, guiding him through some very difficult periods, and she just felt really that he was almost an extension, a part of the family. Well, he must have felt like that, as I said, because after all, no other monarch ever addressed a sitting British Prime Minister by their first name. Now that, as I said, has to be something of an achievement. We've a lot to thank these people for: King George, Winston Churchill, and as ever, the wonderful monarch of 70 years. But it's great to get these insights. Neil Sean in the very heart of London.